All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We still have people trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a few minutes worth of housekeeping items to go through, and we've got a lot of exciting content to get to today. So thank you so much for being here for our collections deep dive, where every month we're talking with a Smithsonian expert to get more information about the projects we've been transcribing together. I'm Emily Cain, Community Coordinator at the Smithsonian Transcription Center, which is the Smithsonian's largest online community transcription and crowdsourcing platform. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Just a quick reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded and we are live streaming on the Transcription Center's YouTube channel. The full recording of this webinar will also be available on YouTube with captions following the event, which is where you can find our previous deep dives as well, and I highly recommend checking those out. If you're joining us in our Zoom webinar today, please click on the Q&A button to add your questions at any time. And if you need live captioning, you can click on the live transcript button on the bottom menu bar and then select show subtitles. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to leave your questions in the comments there. You can also tweet at transcribed.si or email us at transcribe@si.edu. Our program coordinator, Caitlin Haynes, and NMAAHC Rights and Reproductions Manager, Doug Remley, are with us behind the scenes today. If you're joining us on Zoom, you'll see them dropping relevant links in the chat and answering some of your questions. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll find those links in the video description. Now, next Monday, May 31st, will be the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Today, we'll be discussing the materials we've been transcribing together related to the survivors, witnesses, and their families. Whether you transcribe those materials with us or are completely new to the process, this is a great opportunity to ask questions about the powerful stories behind those collections, as well as best practices for transcribing and reviewing. Last Monday, we completed over 500 pages of materials related to the Tulsa Race Massacre and its aftermath, including birthday celebration and funeral programs of survivors, family scrapbooks, and firsthand accounts by Black Tulsans from the collections at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you so much to everyone out there who played a role in transcribing these collections and in sharing and honoring this history with us. Every word transcribed on our platform helps to make the Smithsonian's historical collections more accessible, readable, and fully text searchable across our online databases and other major search engines. You are quite literally helping us to unlock history and share the treasures of the Smithsonian with the world. If you'd like to learn more about joining our digital volunteer community and contributing to TC projects, reach out to us in the Q&A or comments, send us a DM on social media, or email us directly. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's webinar topic. Here with me today is historian and curator Paul Gardullo from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Paul directs the NMAAHC Center for the Study of Global Slavery, and since 2007 has been part of the core team focused on building the museum's foundational collections and conceiving and crafting its exhibitions. He curated the inaugural exhibition, The Power of Place, which contains the museum's exhibit on the Tulsa Race Massacre. He is now project director for a new exhibition entitled Make Good the Promises, Reconstruction and its Legacies, and is co-editor of the companion volume. Those will both be available to celebrate the museum's 5th anniversary later this year. It's good to have you with us today, Paul. Thank you for joining.
It's great to be here, Emily. Good to see you all, and thanks to all the tremendous work of the transcribers who are with us.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we'll get right into it, but before we get to the events of May 31st, I was hoping that you could sort of set the scene for everyone who's joining us today. What does Tulsa, and specifically the Greenwood community in Tulsa, look like in early 1921?
In early 1921, Greenwood, the Black community of Tulsa, is a vibrant, bustling community of Black strivers with hundreds of businesses, thousands of homes, churches, hospitals. It's like a large African American section of a growing, robust city And I have to say that it's in part, it's due to the long-term presence of African Americans in Oklahoma, dating back to when Oklahoma was Indian territory. So the first African Americans migrated to Tulsa on the Trail of Tears, many of whom were enslaved, with Cherokees and Chickasaw and other native nations that were forcibly migrated to what is now Oklahoma. Following the Civil War and emancipation, a plethora of Black communities started to form townships, freedom communities, and official towns in and throughout Oklahoma. And so when there became boosterism to build a state, there was a large movement among these Black towns to create Oklahoma as an all-Black state, a free state of Oklahoma. And so there had been a long surge of Black movement to Oklahoma through the 19th century and up into statehood, which came in 1908. And what's horrific about the situation is that the first state law that was enacted in Oklahoma was segregation, legal segregation. And so as Tulsa became a burgeoning sort of city due to the oil rush, when oil is discovered, you have this city within a city, and that's Greenwood. And it's filled with all sorts of places, from confectionaries to theaters, to hotels with 50 plus rooms. And all of the money is sort of recirculating within the community because of segregation.
So as this Black community is thriving in Tulsa, and it sounds like across Oklahoma perhaps as well, what is sort of the broader context of race relations in the United States? Because this event that we're going to be talking about today was by no means an isolated one.
So as you see this development of Black cultural, social, and economic power happening, is a concurrent movement, a retrenchment of white supremacy, of white racism that is establishing itself strongly in Tulsa itself. Tulsa is a bastion of the Confederate memory movement, of the Lost Cause. Nathan Bedford Forrest, who founded the KKK and was a Confederate general, came to Tulsa in 1915, 1916. In the convention center, where we'll learn that many Black Greenwood residents were interred, showed on repertory Birth of a Nation, the most famous movie of the early part of the 20th century, and a racist depiction of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so you have this resurgent and emergent and cemented white supremacy that is happening at the same time as African Americans are growing and becoming more vocal about their calls for equality and freedom. And you're right, Emily, this isn't just happening in Tulsa. This isn't just in a place where there's been numerous these Black communities. This is happening all across the nation. And forms of racial violence and mass acts of racial violence were happening dating back to right immediately following the Civil War in New Orleans, in Memphis, in Colfax, in Louisiana, in Wilmington, North Carolina, all in the late 19th century. The 20th century, we just moved through Red Summer, which was 1919, where there was mass acts of racial violence in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and up the road from Tulsa in Elaine, Arkansas. And so this is a pattern that has been established that is following Black success, that is sort of instilling terror in the wake of Black success.
Yeah. And NMAAHC has some really fabulous resources and collections related to some of these other acts of terror that are happening around the same time in different parts of the country. So maybe we can share a link to the chat for people who are interested in learning more about that broader context and some of these other similar events that are happening. let's get straight to May 31st, or I think maybe May 30th is when the, sort of seeds of this exact instance are planted.
Yeah, and so I mean, you have this sense now. I think everybody's got this sense of Tulsa as a tinderbox that's waiting to ignite, right? It's there is this fear on the part of white Tulsans that their Black neighbors are getting too powerful, too wealthy. That's attached to certain sort of well-entrenched forms of racism. And one of those entrenched forms of racism comes with this mythology that's being developed and deployed, right, for now decades, which is that white women in particular are threatened, often sexually, by Black men, and that therefore then Black men need to be punished and whole Black communities need to be punished. Now, again, this is a myth. It is antithetical to the actual history, which is a history of violence primarily against Black women by white men that reaches well back into slavery. And so what you have is this narrative of Black sexual predation on white women. And on May 30th, there is a young Black man named Dick Rowland who works as a shoe shiner in White Tulsa. And the place where he works does not allow African Americans to use the restrooms in that building. You have to go across the street and enter a hotel and go to the fourth floor of this hotel or a public building, where that is where they're allowed, right, as segregated citizens to use the restrooms. Dick Rowland goes into that building. There he encounters a young woman named Sarah Page. She is an elevator operator. Something happens between them. Possibly he trips going into the elevator. She exclaims, and suddenly that powder keg is ignited. White Tulsans paint this encounter as an attempted rape in broad daylight on Tulsa city streets in public, and Dick Rowland is arrested and he is held. And white Tulsans begin to assemble, and Black Tulsans, who again are powerfully manifesting their sense of protection of their own, assemble as well to protect young Dick Rowland from this mob, from being lynched. And over the course of the night, when people are massing and retreating back into their communities, a gun goes off. And that is the pretext for what ensues, which is 2 days of full-on destruction of Greenwood by white Tulsan mobs. Homes are looted, homes are ransacked, homes are burned to the ground and destroyed. Scores of people are murdered. We do not know how many, in fact. It's up to as many as 300 over the course of 2 days. The city shuts down all the railroads. The city will not let anyone into Tulsa, and white mobs are deputized by the city and the police to do what they will. And we're talking about not just when I say homes and businesses, we're talking in the thousands, at least 1,000 homes. The entire neighborhood burned to the ground across 2 days.
So this is really sort of unimaginable destruction to anybody who wasn't there to see this. I mean, it's sort of at a horrific scale. And it's accompanied by, like you mentioned, a total failure by the local government to adequately protect its Black citizens in any way.
Right. Yes. Or in their language of the day, it's probably not a failure.
Yeah.
It's partially an intent of dealing with a community. We're talking about a city that is awash in money around oil.
Mm-hmm.
The land that Black homeowners, business owners owned is incredibly valuable. There is a strong desire on the part of certain constituencies and groups to occupy that land. And so immediately following the race massacre, we have laws instituted by the city that attempt to say to the Black community, you can't build back here unless you're building with materials that are absolutely fireproof, right? This is being told to people whose lives have just been torn apart, burned to the ground, and devastated. Mm-hmm. Those people, in order to stay, need to be able to build back with anything they have. And so there is a legal movement in the courts to allow people who wish to stay, and there are hundreds who wish to stay, to rebuild with whatever they have on hand.
Yeah. Well,
and so it's a failure, but it's also not a failure on the part of the city.
A calculation. Yeah.
Yes.
So I want to keep talking about the events. Certainly, last week, our community transcribed B.C. Franklin's first-person account, his manuscript of the massacre. Can you tell us more about him, and if there are any? My understanding is that this manuscript was sort of lost for a long time. Is there anything really special that we learned from that new material?
Yeah, there's special things that we learned from all of the material and the process of collecting. And so, what I think is important to realize is when we began to think about the exhibitions that we wanted to present when the museum opened, we thought it was essential to tell a story like the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Let's tell a story to tell the unvarnished truth in the terms of John Hope Franklin, who is B.C. Franklin's son, to tell a story of the horrors that are within our history, but also the great resilience that's in our history. And when you're beginning to think about, well, how can we tell this? What is the material culture that we can use to sort of bring this history home for people? That's where the challenge lies. And so we began a process over 6 years, my colleagues and I at the museum, of beginning to build trust and think about, where are there materials? Where can we find materials? And so the B.C. Franklin manuscript epitomizes what can be found when the right effort is made. The effort that is sort of rooted in building trust and telling the truth with communities. And so this manuscript that was written in 1931 and was lost from B.C. Franklin, and I'll come back and tell his story in a second, lost from his family members and sold in a storage unit, over time came back to light because people in Tulsa heard that the Smithsonian was doing work, and we're looking for materials. And we were looking for materials to tell this story on the National Mall. And so materials from ephemeral objects like this to many of the materials that were transcribed by our transcribers here were really unknown before this process, and they've really become to fill a vast silence in this history. And I think we could talk a little bit about this document if we want, but I think let me back up and answer your question about who was B.C. Franklin. B.C. Franklin was a lawyer. His family had moved to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and so he was born in 1879. He was a lifelong resident of Oklahoma, and he had been living prior to 1921 in Rentisville, which is a small Black community where his wife and his 2 children lived. And he moved to Tulsa to establish his business in early 1921, 4 to 5 months before the massacre. And he and his partner, who you see pictured there, Spears, and their law office was the legal firm that successfully fought against the city to and successfully secured the rights for African American business owners to rebuild with anything they had on hand. That's them pictured there with their law books, working from a Red Cross tent in June of 1921, close to the site of where their law offices had been burned to the ground. And so Buck Colbert Franklin, he's a lawyer. But what's amazing is that he's also an incredible, incredible writer. And he writes this 10-page evocative memory of the Tulsa Massacre that is different than anything I've ever read. I mean, many of the treatments from of survivors, which are deeply, deeply valuable and important, really situate themselves within that moment of the riot and its happening and its immediate aftermath. What happens in this manuscript, in this document, is Buck Colbert Franklin meditates on 3 moments in time. And he follows the life story of an African-American veteran, right, through those 3 moments in time in 1917, 1921 at the heart of the violence, and then 10 years later in 1931. And in so doing, he allows us to imagine into this moment and from 100 years later in a way that the best of art can do, the best of literature can do. And I think anybody who is working on that transcription, I'd love to hear their opinion about that too, because I think this is where memory meets and testimony meets literature and gives us the language to sit with this horrendous violence that has happened in a way that other things don't allow us to. So I'm really proud of this, that this material is in the Smithsonian, because I think it's one of the things that gives us tools to reckon with this history and to help process it. Even for people who don't have any connection to the event itself.
Yeah, and transcription of these documents, I have to say, is a really powerful way to connect with those sorts of first-person accounts of these histories. It really encourages you to dig really deep and read every single word and be a part of those documents and sort of the kind of circulation of that knowledge and really feel the moment when they're being written. That's one of the #1 pieces of feedback that we hear from our volunteers.
Yeah.
So we saw a picture of BC Franklin in the Red Cross tent after the fact. Can you tell us a little bit about what those efforts look like as the Red Cross moves into the community and people are trying to rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, the Red Cross is finally given access to come to Tulsa after the first couple of days when the city is shutting them out. And they make a national effort. They come from Washington, D.C. There's a gentleman named Maurice Willows who runs the effort of recovery immediately in the aftermath of the massacre. Maurice Willows is white. He is unilaterally lauded within all segments of the community for, really heroic work that is happening by the Red Cross to help people get established as refugees almost in their own homeland. And what's also important to recognize is that there's, alongside the work of the Red Cross, there are these numerous efforts by the Black community themselves to sort of help refugees. Sometimes riot victims. Some of the victims' families themselves begin to organize immediately. Dr. Olivia Hooker, who is a massacre survivor, her father, who ran a business on Greenwood, organized a tour of African American churches on the East Coast that began drives that would send barrels of shoes and other goods to be housed at Booker T. Washington High School, one of the only buildings that wasn't burned down. that victims could come and sort of, get materials to begin to put their lives together. The Black press, from the Oklahoma newspapers, the Tulsa Star, to the big newspapers like the Chicago Defender, also ran drives that sent money. And those Black communities, those broader Black communities in Oklahoma around Tulsa that I mentioned before, they were instrumental in sort of helping people get their footing again in the years following. So it's this mix of support, and it's really needed, because when you look at the images, it's total devastation. Yeah. Here's the amazing piece of the story, is that despite thousands of people leaving Tulsa in an exodus, because I think we need to put ourselves a little bit in the shoes of people, in the minds of people who just had their lives torn apart. Many people left, but many more stayed. And within a year, 80 businesses were rebuilt. In the matter of 4 years, hundreds of businesses were rebuilt. And in fact, the National Negro Business League, which is like the version of the Urban League, right, decided to hold their national convention in 1925 in Tulsa, 4 years later. And we just have to imagine, we have pictures of it, we have film of it, to imagine the incredible resolve and strength and courage and defiance that it took to sort of say, we're here and we're not going anywhere, and we're back. And so that is, I think, as important a story to tell as this story of devastation and destruction.
Absolutely. Despite all of the efforts that are being made to sort of stop them from coming back by the local government, and despite knowing really very clearly now the attitudes of the rest of their community, not that they wouldn't have known before, that's really incredible. I think one of those families was the Williams family, is that correct? And we transcribed a lot of their materials last week as well. A lot of, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Like commencement programs from the high school, for example, a lot of materials that sort of show that life went on and families continued to build lives together in this space after this event.
Yeah, the Williams family is an amazing family, amazing story. If the transcribers have watched Watchmen on HBO in the past year, they know how central the Williams family and their business, the Dreamland Theater, was to that take on this history. Lula Williams and her husband, John Wesley Williams, came to Tulsa, came to Oklahoma early in the century. They built an amazing business. All right. They had the Dreamland Theater. They had a garage. They had another building with a confectionery with multiple sort of tenants happening. They were the epitome, along with several other families, of like the immense wealth. Right. And it's, again, important to say that there was an incredible breadth of economic wealth, that there were incredibly wealthy people, and there were middle class people, and there were poorer people who were all living in Greenwood. But the Dreamland Theater becomes evocative, I think, because the name itself sort of stands for what African Americans at the time aspired their community to be, right? And so it was burned to the ground. You see Lula, her picture in her obituary is here. Her son, William, or W.D. Williams, was a teenager at the time of the riot. They're one of these tremendous families who rebuild their business. W.D. Williams goes off to study at Hampton Institute, now Hampton University in Virginia. And we have materials that detail his life there at Hampton in scrapbooks, lovingly put together, that sort of detail his life, but also his relationship with his mom, who, despite their success in building the business back, she never really recovers. She constantly is battling with the trauma, what we now call, post-traumatic stress disorder from this massacre. Lula Williams dies. She's put into what was then called an asylum in the late 1920s. She dies in 1928. WD, who has a bright future anywhere, decides to move back to Tulsa, where he becomes a teacher. He teaches at Booker T. Washington High School history, and he becomes the unofficial keeper of the memory of the massacre for decades. And he begins to compile race postcards of the massacre that were circulated amongst people, much like lynching photographs were circulated amongst white racists at the time. He begins to collect what he can to make sure that this history is not lost. And he's also collecting the story of his work as a teacher. And he weaves those two things together, and that's what we begin to see in our collection, is these legacies that move forward from the event of 1921, a legacy of continued racism and silence around what had happened, and a legacy of incredible resilience and community building and rebuilding that continues on the part of Greenwood across the mid-century years. And so I think that this collection here and becomes an incredible, beautiful, personal window into these two legacies. And they really get at the heart of what our museum is all about. It's about making these stories feel human, bringing them to a human scale so we can understand them, connecting the dots between the past and present, and making us all feel connected to this story that is central to American history.
Yeah, that's incredible. We're going to start taking audience questions in just a minute. So I just want to remind everybody that you can use the Q&A feature to add your questions in there for Paul, and we'll be answering those. Before we start doing that, I want to make sure that we're really clear about one issue. Can you tell us a little bit about whether any of the perpetrators of this event were brought to justice, or any sort of consequences that were faced?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and an important question. So there were most of the people who were indicted in the aftermath of this massacre were African Americans, who were indicted for inciting a riot, right? And that's where this language, the language of a riot versus a massacre versus a pogrom is important and interesting, and we can talk about that. But the language of the race riot that began to get developed in the immediate aftermath of what had happened was one that was legal language that was deployed so that reparations could not be sought on the part of African Americans, right? So there were a few whites who were indicted, but no one was ever fully prosecuted. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, that white mobs were deputized by the police. And so their work was official, right? Their work in destruction, their work in murder and so there were no redress to the event. In fact, the only reparations, that happened in the aftermath of this event were reparations that were awarded to a few white families. So no African Americans, but a few white families, which is ironic to say the least, because of the connections that they had to sort of certain kind of property that was contested at the time, and weaponry. So the other kind of really important thing to note about this aftermath, and it's rooted in redress, is that, you know, African Americans were herded into internment camps, as I mentioned before, at the convention center, at the ballpark, thousands of them. They were not allowed to leave those places for their own safety. And in order to leave, they had to have a white community member come to the place where they were being held who could attest to their reputability, that they would not, that would not be a cause for future violence. And they had to be tracked and traced in the city following that, in those months following. So there's levels of complexity to this. And that is what is at the heart, I think, of many of the questions around and the arguments around direct reparations that exist to this day. And you all may have seen that the 3 known survivors of the massacre were at Congress this week to testify again to their history, and a new reparations bill is being introduced.
Yeah. Well, I think you've certainly done a good job of answering this already, but just in case you have more to say, we do have a question from an audience member about why we feel this event is still relevant today.
I think that's an important question, and I think it's a good question that we should be all asking of ourselves. I think this event is relevant because there's never been a full truth telling about this event. There's never been a full reckoning of this event. There's never been an accounting for the losses that were made manifest about this event. And the way those losses have been visited from one generation to the next, right? The losses that can be counted in terms of wealth accumulation, but also in terms of emotional health and well-being. And so I think those are reasons that this becomes important for us to remember it. I think it also becomes important for us to remember it because while this story is an exemplary story of something that happened on a rather large scale, it's not a unique story. This is the kind of story that was taking place across America over time, and it allowed for a certain systems and structures of racism to become set and be not just perpetrated, but accepted over time. And I think those are some of the reasons that it's important to remember. I think it is also important to remember because it's important to remember that we have that story of resilience, that story of people rebuilding without any help, right? Without any redress, and having to rebuild multiple times, not just because of another flashpoint of mass racial violence, but because of other systems, that the system of segregation and systemic racism have structured into the community. In the 1960s, the highway came through in the heart of Greenwood, which was then again thriving, and it has profound economic impact on the community as well. So I hope that answers your question. But I think one of the key things that I think, in fact, the key thing that I think the museum can help do is to present these materials to all Americans and to have people come face to face with them and begin to ask these questions of ourselves and begin to ask them of each other, so we can see together what's important to remember. Why have we not been taught this? What do we still have to learn from our past? And how are the dots connected to our present?
Yeah, that's a lovely call to action. And maybe that's something that our viewers can think about doing today, and that I will certainly think about doing. Ask your loved ones at home, talk about this event, and see what you come up with together.
And you all have come face to face with that, with these materials. And I would say that this is part of, this broader work of justice that we're engaged in. People talk about reconciliation. It's hard to have reconciliation until we have a common understanding of the past. And it's hard to have reconciliation divorced from conversations around repair and justice. And I think this work that you all have been engaged in is a work of repair and recovery, is amongst the kind of work of justice that we talk about when we're talking about justice. I think these acts become that you all are taking are ones that are vital. They might not be sort of sufficient to the whole scope, but it is this kind of work that becomes part of a constellation that pair kind of justice and reconciliation together in these acts of recovery. So I do want to say that this kind of work is something that museums do, and it's work that volunteers do within the work of museums. So I want to thank you all personally for that.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And I love the imagery of a constellation of efforts and actions that make up a broader conversation about repair and restorative justice. I also will just say really quickly, I imagine it's really easy to see that this event happened 100 years ago and think 100 years is a long time. But like you mentioned, there are survivors of the massacre still alive today, and they are still fighting to see any sort of justice related to the experience that they had as children.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, and it's not so distant. And this is why the work of centering survivors and their descendants in the story becomes essential. Because as soon as you do that, you realize it's not so distant. You realize there are people living now who lived through this event. Their children who were impacted in these ways, like Lula Williams was, are living now. Their grandchildren. These things are visited from generation to generation. And it is very real for many. It is very raw for many. And it is very connected to narratives and practices of injustice that continue today. It's hard for us to sometimes remember that that these events are closer, not just in time, but in practice, to where we live now.
Changing track a little bit, more kind of specific question from viewer Deborah. Thank you, Deborah. Is it true that the Tulsa Massacre represents the first air attack on American citizens when planes dropped flaming turpentine bombs?
I don't know if I can give you the definitive answer to that. I do know that that we have eyewitness accounts that testify that incendiary devices were dropped from planes onto the neighborhood. B.C. Franklin writes about it. He looks outside, he sees planes flying overhead, his documented planes that were flying overhead. They were not military planes, they were privately owned. And they were, and yes, they dropped things akin to Molotov cocktails onto cities. I think that is maybe the first and only, but I hesitate to kind of talk about this event in terms of firsts or onlys or biggests. I think I really do see the desire to do that because you want to kind of get some sense of scale, but this is also as much to do with this broader narrative of lynching that we talked about before that was happening. That had this undercurrent and of acceptance that things were okay, that certain people are less than human, that our Black neighbors are less than human, that they can be treated. Maybe they don't feel pain. Maybe they don't experience trauma. Maybe they can, and quite literally, their lives are not as worthwhile as other lives. And I think those are the things that have real purchase for us today, in addition to thinking about the massive scale of this particular event.
I see a comment from one of our viewers. Oh, I may have lost it. From Lori, thank you, Lori, who says that growing up in Tulsa in the 60s and 70s, this wasn't talked about or taught, and sometimes was even completely denied. I think that experience is probably, certainly the not knowing about this incident is probably shared by people who grew up outside of Tulsa. Can you talk about the way that this event was sort of erased in many ways, or attempted to be erased for a long time? And
yeah, I mean, I think there's different, there's different histories of the memory of this. I think certainly from an African-American perspective within Tulsa, there was a desire both to hold on to the memory of this event so that it wouldn't be forgotten, but also this, I wouldn't call it shame, but hushed tones around this, because I think you can imagine, both from a perspective of fear of things being replicated, life repeating itself, and also a feeling of a less of an acceptance of speaking out loud about issues of devastation and trauma from within this period of time also persists. And so that's why you get people a lot of people who talked about it, but within their community, within their family, maybe less so publicly, because there was no public venue to talk about something like this. And then there's this the broader narrative of the official narrative of Tulsa, of white Tulsa, and then expand out from there. That was, I think, partially about suppressing this narrative because they didn't want to be sort of held accountable. And then that accountability moves into, or lack of accountability moves into, this sort of narratives that are suppressed or avoided because of guilt or shame, right? And I think those things are powerful motivators for us personally, and they're powerful motivators for us collectively. And we need to be better at moving past that, both personally, as we know the power in telling our stories personally and what that means therapeutically for us, but our institutions need to be better at that, providing people with the spaces to hear the truth. People are hungry for the truth when they hear it. And I think that's a demonstration writ large of our museum. It doesn't mean that truth is only filled with destruction and devastation and horror. That truth is also filled with incredible joy and resilience and beauty, despite and outside of the boundaries of that horror. But it needs to be spoken. It needs to be seen. And I think that I'm proud that the museum sort of sees that as an essential part of its mission, whether or not it's in the exhibitions that we display, the programs that we provide, or the archives that we try to make public. And so I don't know if that directly answers all of what you want to say, but that was a lot. That might be the extent of anything that I have to say on it.
It's a really big question to answer. And I think it speaks again to the power of materials like the ones that NMAAHC has collected and that we have transcribed together that are from the perspective of witnesses and survivors and their families, because those sorts of first person accounts can give us a really kind of can grant us a level of empathy that maybe nothing else can, especially in a situation where, you know, the figures in authority who have been sort of deputizing rioters and murderers are often the ones who get to control the narrative for a very long time. And these materials help us to push past that, are part of what helps us push past them.
I think we also need to be cognizant of the narratives that places embrace and are not yet willing to embrace. Certainly, one of our goals in doing this work isn't just to take history and bring it to the Smithsonian and evacuate it from the places where the history happens. One of our goals was to help ensure that this story could be of use back in Tulsa, to help amplify efforts to have a reckoning there. And I think we're seeing that. I don't want to go too far in terms of the museum's role in that, but I do think we are an important voice in lending, in convening that kind of a conversation and in lending authority, and demonstrating that this conversation needs to happen. It doesn't just need to happen in community conversations, it actually needs to happen in our institutions, right? From schools to museums, et cetera. And I think that it also becomes a way, as I said before, of opening unlocking these conversations in other places. And so that becomes a valuable sort of mode of operations for museums and archives to have. What I think is important is to not get too comfortable with the narratives that we find. That now certain narratives that had never been told before about 1921 and the 1920s can be told. But how comfortable are we talking about more recent events and their connections? Because I guarantee you that the African-American citizens of Tulsa see a bright line connecting yesterday to today. And we need to be able to find the right ways to convene those kinds of conversations and not just relegate our history to the safe prism of the past.
Absolutely. We do have a question actually about what the Greenwood community looks like today. Can you sort of paint a picture for people who have never been to Tulsa?
Oh, goodness. North Tulsa is, well, I began our talk talking about Tulsa in 1921, prior to the massacre. Tulsa in 2021. Tulsa in general has gone through a resurgence, and I'm not an urban planner. I'm a historian. So, and I haven't been personally to Tulsa now in 5 years. But when I was last in Tulsa, it had been undergoing a resurgence that many small cities had been undergoing. They had rebuilt. They were reinvesting in downtown. They were building an arts district. The museums, such as the Art Museum, was building an annex near where Greenwood is. The Woody Guthrie Center was being established. All this was happening so this resurgence was all happening amidst a neglect. Benign or nefarious, a neglect of the sort of that history and the community of North Tulsa that was primarily Black. So while legal segregation does not exist in Tulsa and has not, the city is segregated. When you move from North Tulsa, which is where Greenwood is, into the other parts of Tulsa, you see a stark difference between in wealth. The parks look different. The schools look different. The city has a highway that has bifurcated, has run through the heart of what Greenwood is now. And while there is this resurgence and there is a memorial built, it's in the shadow of the overpass of that highway. And so there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done on questions of equality and questions of race. In the aftermath of many of the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, Tulsa instituted several laws that allow for stricter policing around protests. The reparations movement has continued and been bolstered and is now tied together with Black Lives Matter movements. And so that makes for an interesting sort of combination of conversations that are happening. And so I think there's a lot of desire for reckoning in Tulsa, but it remains to be seen how much of that storytelling gets related to these contemporary issues we're talking about.
Wow. Well, we only have a few minutes left. So I think what I would like to end on is just to ask if you have any sort of closing thoughts or tidbits that we didn't get to that you want to make sure people hear.
I don't think I have tidbits.
There's so many.
I think one of the key things here's what I would like to leave people with is that we spend a lot of time talking about devastation and destruction and the horror that people commit upon others. I want to leave you with this. I think perhaps as important, more important than remembering that is that this story is an incredible story of the human spirit. These stories of survival are built on love. These stories of truth-telling are built on love and the desire for justice. And that is what the big takeaway from this story of Greenwood, its destruction, its rebirth, its resilience, its need for continual struggle for justice is all about. It's a story of people's spirits not being destroyed by the worst that we can offer. And that's what I hope that you all feel connected to when you're doing this work for us.
That's a really lovely sentiment. And we would absolutely love to hear in the chat from anyone who's done transcribing on these materials, how it made you feel to work on those, what you learned from it. And we'll be able to pass that feedback along to Paul and to our other colleagues at NMAAHC if you feel inclined to share. And thank you so much again for your work on that. So I will just say that I know there are so many questions that we didn't get to today. So I will just close by saying that if you would like to reach out to us, you can do so at transcribe@si.edu. That'll come directly to me and my colleagues at the Transcription Center, and we can work with Paul and our friends at NMAAHC to get some of those answers that you're looking for. We'll also be saving a copy of the chat so that we can kind of bear those questions in mind for you. I think that's all that we have time for today, but thank you so much for joining us, Paul. It has really been incredibly enlightening and informative and wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for your thoughtful commentary on these items and this history.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. So if you have more questions, like I said, please continue to tweet at transcribe.si or email us at transcribe@si.edu, and we'll get back to you with some answers. To stay up to date on new projects, forthcoming events, and other Transcription Center news, you can follow us on Twitter or head to our website, which is transcription.si.edu. It's on the screen right now, and sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is where we communicate that sort of information. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This has been really lovely. We've loved having you and talking with you, and for giving these projects your time and attention. Happy transcribing, everyone, and we will see you next time. Thanks again.